Upon the highway leading west from the city of Erantle, 3 carriages sped through the forests and fields of Jesm County. Alongside them rode 12 mounted footmen, 2 to the side of each carriage, 4 leading the front and 2 bringing up the rear. The footmen were divided into 3 sets of livery for the 3 houses that they represented. In the middle carriage together rode the heads of those houses, plus 1 other. To a traveler on the wayside, their swift passage over the rough pavement would fill the air with a great clamor, but not a trace of this sound could be heard within. These were the most luxurious coaches in House Wagner's fleet of vehicles, masterfully engineered and magically enchanted to provide a comfortable journey that might only be surpassed by the state coaches of great nations. Slowly turning a delicate-looking white mask in her hands, Ludmilla absently gazed out of the window at the scenery of carefully managed forests lining the highway. "It's a rare thing to see you spaced out like that," Clara's voice came from beside her. "Did your audience with Lady Schulte really give you that much to think about?" Ludmilla had not mentioned anything about the previous night's meeting with her liege, beyond the fact that she had spoken with her at length. Still dazed over what had come to pass, she herself could still scarcely believe that the dreamlike event had occurred. "Lady Schulte ratified my oath of fealty," she replied. "A part of it, at least." "That's wonderful news, then." Clara pressed her palms together with a pleased expression for her friend. "You've been agonizing over it for weeks, haven't you?" Ludmilla nodded slightly. It was something that had been quietly eating away at her, as more and more of the nobility had done so and resumed their regular lives. A noble's contract with their liege was the basis of aristocratic society, and not having one was akin to being left alone and vulnerable to the myriad dangers of the world, cast adrift with no purpose or direction. Ludmilla could not even figure out how she would compose her own. She was a frontier noble whose traditional duties were rendered unnecessary by the powerful undead armies of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Her underdeveloped fief was overshadowed hundreds of times over by the wealth and influence of even the poorest of the inner territories, so she could offer little on that front as well. The audience that she had requested in order to consult with her liege over the dilemma in Facet County and had, instead, ended up in her formally swearing herself to Lady Schulte's service. It was a sudden turn of events that may as well have been spun from a minstrel's tale. Well, she guessed that no minstrel would ever actually use something like this. It was not on a battlefield after some legendary feat of martial prowess, nor in a grand ceremony witnessed by a vast court, but on the floor of the solar of her borrowed city manor in the middle of the night. Ludmilla had pledged to follow after Lady Schulte in her duty, to be a defender of the realm, and uphold His Majesty's desired order. A solemn oath, sealed by her lady's kiss. The act itself was something she recognized as being very out of character for her organized and formal self. It wasn't even on paper, but it felt so right that she could not even think to cross-examine it. It was something that she would not forget for the rest of her life, a private and personal moment that had been etched into her being. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Clara lean towards her with a furrow on her brow. Clara exchanged glances with Leanne and Florian seated across from them. They shrugged and shook their heads in return. "If that's what is supposed to happen," Countess Corland said, "I think I want a redo of my contract. All I received was a stamped document from the royal court, delivered to my letterbox." Ludmilla looks positively love-struck. The light laughter that followed pulled Ludmilla out of her daze, and she turned her head towards the others. Seeing her friend was back again, Clara spoke. "So, what is it that has your head in the clouds, exactly? Even if I was offered tax immunity, I don't think I'd have that look on my face." "Well, maybe." "Duty," Ludmilla answered. "Duty?" Clara made a face at the decidedly unexciting answer. "What sort of duty?" "It is difficult to explain," Ludmilla said. "I'm not wholly certain as to the extent of it, but I think I can do something about House Facet." "Eh? Really?" Florine said, "But Lady Schulte is the Minister of Transportation, isn't she?" "She is," Leanne nodded. "This isn't something the Minister of Transportation should have jurisdiction over, should she?" "It shouldn't be," Clara agreed, "unless what is happening in Facet County is interfering with the roads. Lady Schulte is not just the Minister of Transportation." The 3 other women leaned away from her ardor. Ludmilla cleared her throat, and adjusted her tone. "She also continues to uphold her duties from before Erantle's annexation," she told them. "She is a defender of the realm, an enemy of all who would oppose His Majesty's order." The first part of my oath of fealty was to assist her and carry out this same duty, to the furthest extent of my ability. Then you've essentially resumed your duties as a frontier noble? Clara ventured. The terms sound fairly similar. On a very basic level, there are similarities, Ludmilla answered. But there is so much more now. It will take me some time to learn and understand its intricacies. Or rather, she wasn't sure if there were any intricacies. It was authority in the absolute sense, raw, unyielding power. Opposition to His Majesty's will was unacceptable, defiance, an unforgivable sin. She was now the agent of an order above any and all laws, traditions or practices that would impede her in the pursuit of her quarry. It didn't mean that she could flagrantly ignore the laws of the Sorceress Kingdom, and there were other aspects of His Majesty's will to be observed, but it did have the effect of cutting through red tape, political posturing and legal pretense. Ludmilla had always welcomed duty, embraced it, but now, for the first time, duty sent a chill through her being. The members of the King's cabinet all held this authority, Lady Aura and Lord Mayor included, and any servant of His Majesty could be called upon for aid. She wondered how one conducted themselves in regards to this duty. There were certainly no known incidents that she could construe were a result of its exercise, so there must be more that she was missing. Perhaps, rather than a brute force, it was something better wielded with quiet precision. A shadow appeared over the window, turning their attention to one of Clara's footmen who had maneuvered his horse alongside them. Ludmilla opened the crystal pane, and the roar of the sounds outdoors filled the cabin. "Lady Corlin," the footman said over the din, "the maids would like to stop and deliver lunch." "That sounds good," Clara replied, leaning over Ludmilla to speak to him. "I'm starting to feel peckish. We'll stop to have lunch delivered, but we won't be stopping while we dine. You may keep the pace down until everyone has settled their meals." "It will be done, my lady." The young man guided his horse away and Ludmilla closed the window. All of the footmen escorting them seemed to be well-trained and experienced members of their respective households. Beyond their domestic training, they appeared to be proficient in horsemanship and the weapons that they carried as well. After the entourage rolled to a stop on the side of the road, Ludmilla left the carriage to stretch her tired body. Her mind was still restless from the previous night, but she was beginning to physically tire from not having slept at all. Attempting to distract her attention away from her fatigue, she turned to a nearby footman. "How far have we come?" she asked. "We're just leaving Jesm County, Lady Camilla," he responded cordially. "Once we're through the next town, we'll be past most of the traffic delivering goods to and from Rantle. We should be able to pick up speed then." Unlike the cultivated fields and pastures of the northeast and the fertile valleys to the south of the city, a large portion of the western half of the duchy was dominated by forested limestone hills which occupied the gap between the Azalizia Mountains to the north and the border ranges to the south. The highway followed a lightly winding path which passed the occasional patches of farmland nestled between tall stands of trees. Far to the west, she thought she could see the buildings of the town that the footman mentioned peeking out from behind the rolling landscape. Several maids carrying trays of food walked past her while another footman was setting up a solid oak table across the middle of the coach. When it appeared that preparations were completed, she stepped back up into the carriage, joined by the other noblewomen. The procession carried on, albeit much more slowly, as the drivers and escorts took turns having their meal. Inside their carriage, Ludmilla was presented with a warm, sumptuous feast. Lady Wagner had spared no expense on her part, providing the best experience she could offer. Magical items that kept their food fresh and heated and enchanted decanters of ice-cold wine accompanied their meal. Various other conveniences all combined to make the journey seem more like a relaxing afternoon in a garden rather than a hard drive across the countryside. Even the horses were afforded magical items, enchanted harnesses and bridles which allowed them to run in comfort, their blistering pace sustained by magical horseshoes created in some demi-human nation far to the east. Amongst all of the other luxurious offerings, there was something else that caught the noble's attention. "I can't believe you brought that thing with you, Liane," Florine said as they sat into their meal. "Why not? It's a memento of my lord father," Liane replied, "and a bit of inspiration, no?" The subject of their exchange was a delicately crafted piece of glasswork which had been fashioned into the shape of a wine glass. It shimmered and gleamed in the light of the sun streaming through the carriage window, and its enchanting appearance inextricably drew the eye of any observer. Ludmilla immediately realized that it was enchanted, and beneath the minor illusion was a rather plain-looking item. "What is it?" Ludmilla asked. "Oh, I guess you weren't there for that, being out on the border and all," Leanne said, reaching out to lift the item. "It was a rather amusing topic for a few weeks after it happened." "You mean that's—" Clara's voice trailed off as Leanne grew excited at her recognition. "Yes, this is it." Leanne held up the glass to Ludmilla. "How much do you think this is worth?" "Leanne," Clara said, "I don't think that's a fair question." "Including the cost of the enchantment?" Ludmilla tried to stall for time to think, having no idea how much it was worth. "Che," Leanne pulled back, disappointed. "So even frontier nobles can tell. What is the story behind it?" Ludmilla was curious, and she put a slice of steak in her mouth as she listened to the younger noblewoman. Yes, I guess that's the more important part of this." Leanne brightened again. "Back some months ago, a merchant came by our manor, offering to sell this to our house. So my lord father instructed the butler to let him in and listen to his entire offer. I forgot exactly what it was, something about some master artisan, and he was willing to part with it for a mere 15 gold trade coins. Anyways, what did you think happened?" Ludmilla's chewing slowed. She still had no idea what the piece of glasswork was worth, so she simply shook her head to prompt Lady Wagner to continue her story. "He paid him." Leanne grinned wickedly, "and then he had 4 of the footmen run him through the streets with whips, all the way from the central district to the crossroads south of Erantle. That fool thought he could deceive a noble with such a cheap article." Leanne took a sip out of her glass before resuming her tale. "That isn't the end of the story, though." Leanne leaned forward with a gleam in her ice-blue eyes, lowering her voice. "We tracked down the man's wagon and found a crate full of identical items. The most astonishing thing was that there were a few missing. These are worth 2 silver, 13 copper, including the cost of the enchantment. We could only assume that someone out there fell for the man's ridiculous ploy. After uncovering this, Father declared that this piece was well worth the asking price, simply for the lesson that it holds, that there are some heedless fools out there that think they can actually cheat us, and that there actually exist idiots out there that can fall for such schemes." Ludmilla looked around the table. Clara and Florian had amused expressions after Leanne's finished her tale. Ludmilla could only hope that she would never fall for any similar ruse. They completed lunch, and the plates and glasses were replaced by documents, reference manuals and paperwork. Despite serving as emissaries of the House of Lords, each of them had varying amounts of work to complete before the formal announcement concerning the Empire. Leanne, especially, seemed to be particularly swamped, expanding House Wagner's merchant companies and setting up new ones. Her own work was invading Florian's part of the table. Luckily, Florian had relatively little to do, coming from a quiet agricultural fief mostly away from the main highways with no specific preparations that needed to be made. "So about your new duties, Ludmilla," Clara asked without looking up from her work. "What do you think you'll be able to do?" "It would depend on the extent of House Facet's activities," she answered. "Hopefully they will resolve matters surrounding their succession and commit to stepping down from their illicit behavior." "The chance of that happening is slim to none," Clara said. "You were there when we discussed that, I believe. Each side of the dispute is using the resources from those illicit activities in order to fund the support for their claims. Count Vulcanheim's olive branch might seem an attractive proposal at a glance, but, in the end, it does not break the succession crisis since they should be smart enough to either both refuse or both accept. I am loath to offer Vulcanheim's proposal in the first place since it potentially implicates the entire House of Lords if twisted the wrong way." "Do you really think the final outcome will be that bad though?" Ludmilla asked. Even roughly understanding what she now had the authority to do, Ludmilla decided that some things should only be done as a last resort. The more she thought it through, though, the more it seemed that the last resort was the only option. That option was to remove both parties before they drew the scrutiny of the royal court, that was, unseating House Facet and the other ringleaders in the dispute. Lady Sheltier asserted that those who supported changing the laws might be unhappy that their excuse was denied them, but the restoration of order with a clear message would be accepted as a just outcome and they would not waste resources pursuing an otherwise trifling matter. "We don't know," Clara said after looking to the others. "Like you, most of our dealings with the royal court have been generally positive, so we haven't ever witnessed what they are capable of doing if something displeases them. Personally, I don't want to find out, so if there is anything we can do to help you, that may be the most reliable course to avoid an undesirable outcome. We don't have our own masks though, Florine said. Why a mask, anyways? Leanne asked. And why Camilla? Clara added, for the life of me I still cannot figure that one out. One of the first things Ludmilla had done was spell out the name in various written languages. As with Nonna, it was Theocracy's script that turned up a meaning. A name as ancient as the Theocracy itself, meaning acolyte, or perhaps disciple. Clara should have picked up on its meaning, but she probably associated it with the priesthood. Given that Ludmilla was essentially under the mentorship of Lady Sheltier in the ways of the Sorcerer King's vassals, she found it gratifying that her liege would treat her with such regard. As for the mask, Ludmilla had no idea. She had received the mask and the name from Lady Sheltier, who insisted that she should use both. She picked up the smooth, bone-white adornment from the table and held it in front of her face. Well, she said from behind the item, how does it look? Suspicious, Clara said without hesitation. Weird, said Florine. Creepy, said Leanne. Ludmilla sighed. A sharp crack echoed down the alley, the sound of a supple cane slamming against some solid surface. A handful of heads turned towards the harsh noise, others stole glances, but none stopped or came forward to see what was going on. The pedestrians went about their business and even the sentries in the nearby square seemed to pay no mind. I have eyes, brat. The blind beggar snapped, tell me something I didn't see, or don't be wasting my time. Liam looked to where he had been standing just a moment before and swallowed. The cane had struck a row of old wooden planks, and some now lay fallen and splintered in the muck. If he had not reacted quickly enough to leap away, it would have been his legs instead. There were nobles, sir, Liam said. Nobles? The beggar leaned forward. How many? There were 4 in a coach, 3 coaches. He paused as the beggar's mouth fell open into a confused expression as he cocked his head. 12 nobles, sir, Liam added hurriedly, with big men on horses guarding them. I can count, you little shit. The man hissed, his putrid breath washing over the boy's face. Nobles don't grow on trees. How can there've been 12 at once? Liam backed away, eyeing the once again brandished cane warily even as his mind worked to turn out something of value. It was 12 ladies, the boy said tentatively, dressed all clean and fine. The men were in colors too, armed with steel. That means they were guarding noble ladies, right? You followed them? The beggar asked. Of course he followed them, how else could he have counted who was inside such high carriages? The retort would have the cane flying towards him again, however, so he just followed the beggar's line of questioning. They turned on the Lord's Road, sir, he nodded. I followed and watched from near the manor. Then you saw them come out. The beggar's eyes narrowed. What did they all look like? All young and pretty, sir, the boy replied. There were elf women too. That detail was rare enough to be important, but the beggar only scowled in return. There's no such thing as elf nobles, unit. How were they dressed? Was there anyone made better than the others? Liam squeezed his eyes shut, trying to force out the details from his memory. 3, sir, his eyes popped open again. 3 ladies in better dresses than the rest, all from the carriage in the middle. They didn't look too good when they came out, sir. The servant? The other one that came out with them ran to a hedge and got sick. The beggar frowned. Perhaps that detail wasn't so important. Was there anything on the side of the carriage? The beggar asked. Any pictures on the colored man? There was, a silver wheel on brown, on the side of the carriage, Liam answered. A silver cup on blue, too. The man's expression twisted sourly. Easterners, he spat. What was the last one? There was only 2 on my side, sir, Liam told him. The other side was facing the manor. Useless. The beggar dug his fingers into the cracked wooden cup in front of him. There were several copper coins within, but, when he withdrew his hand, only a single coin remained. But. Liam stilled his tongue as the cane drifted up again. He snatched the copper coin out of the cup, and scurried away with his head down. A passing woman clicked her tongue at the sight of a waif stealing from a blind beggar. Twilight had fallen on Facet Town, the ancestral seat of House Fassett. It was plain that things weren't going so well. The wagons from the west stopped coming since the taking of Erantle, save for a handful which had headed straight through. The shops and inns were still and empty, and every day it seemed the air over the streets grew heavier. The county's vast expanse of dense forests over rugged hills meant that there wasn't an abundance of farmland, and the distance from markets both east and west made things more expensive to ship goods out and in. A long time ago, the nobles tried opening quarries and mines, but failed, and so the highway became the life's blood of the town over generations. Palming the copper coin in his hand, Liam made his way quickly through the narrow back streets and muddy alleys strewn with filth. New information was valuable, and news about nobles made the brokers more open-handed than they would otherwise be. Through the gloom, he spotted the ghostly figures of other children like himself, looking to pawn off what they had learned to those who could make sense out of what they had to share. It was a race to see who could collect the most coin before knowledge of the events grew old and stale. After meandering a block or two, he spotted his next mark. Miss, he said excitedly, did you hear the news? An old lady that had seen too many years turned her pruned face towards him from where she looked out of a window. Oh my, she said, what's this about now, my dear? Nobles have come to town, Liam replied, with fancy coaches and armed men. The wind blew stale air through the streets, tossing wisps of the woman's thin grey hair about. A crack opened in her squinty eyes. A few minutes later, he left the old crone with another coin. One more. I need one more. Liam searched for one more broker on the outskirts of the town. He made his way halfway around before his steps slowed at the edge of the highway and he looked to the fading horizon. Too much time had passed, and there was little chance what he knew was worth anything at this point. He looked down and uncurled his fingers. 2 coins could buy 2 chunks of bread, a third would mean a small strip of salted meat. They needed at least that much. He needed to find something else of value. An angry shout in the distance drew his attention. A small crowd was spilling out from a warehouse into the street nearby. An oppressive atmosphere filled the dimly lit surroundings as he came close. With crossed arms and clenched fists, grown men of all sorts pressed in on the warehouse door. Angry mutters filled the air. In the shadows around the crowd, women and children had backed well away from the building, sensing the tension that mounted around them. If you don't like it, leave, a loud voice sounded over the crowd. There was a rough-looking man at the entrance, flanked by several of the town militia. They did not share the thin and ragged look of the people gathered around them on the street. It ain't about liking it or not. A man shouted back, we got mouths to feed, you can't just double the price of bread like that. Liam's steps slowed. He stopped at a corner near the edge of the scene. We just did, the man standing in front of the warehouse said. If you can't pay, then you can work for the town. Fighting men get food. Liam left as shouts once again rose. From street to shadowed street he ran. All the stores of food told the same story. The price of bread had doubled, the 3rd time in as many weeks. He needed something he could sell. He looked about desperately, eyes darting over the streets and alleys, searching for opportunities. His gaze crossed over the town square and the row of bodies swaying from the large gibbet in the middle. Man or woman, young or old, it didn't matter, the starving weren't even allowed to hunt or forage on the Lord's land, on pain of death. In contrast to the macabre scene, brightly colored flags and banners fluttered over the magically illuminated pavement. The highway and main roads had been scoured clean, the storefronts renovated and repainted. Countess Fassett had announced that it was an order from Erantle, preparations for the trade that would once again flow through the duchy, returning prosperity to their town. He wondered what sort of sick joke this was. Beneath the thin veneer of celebration, its people were desperate and starving and things only grew worse. Liam shed his angry thoughts. The fuming of a child could not be turned into coin. He recalled the nobles in their luxurious coaches that went to visit at the Fassett Manor and decided it was his best chance to learn something that could go towards earning food. The Lord's Manor was constructed up on a hill overlooking the town, ringed by a tall hedge. Footmen stood guard at the entrance where the dirt road led into the estate but, for the most part, they would not bother chasing after curious onlookers unless they came too close. It was from his current vantage that he had watched the carriages roll into the estate and the noble women step out. To his relief, the carriages were still parked in front of the manor. The estate's grounds were brightly lit and, Occasionally, pairs of manservants appeared to look around. He needed to get closer, but he had never been beyond this point for fear of being caught and beaten by the sentries. A dancing light appeared in the darkness, 2 footmen patrolling around the outside of the grounds, one of them holding a pole from which a lantern hung. They stopped to talk with the men at the entrance to the estate. After waiting to see how long they would stay to continue their conversation, Liam slipped into the trees that ringed the base of the hill. The land between the hedge and the tree line was purposely cleared so that those intruding upon the grounds could be easily spotted, so he had to spend time picking his way around through the undergrowth. As the sounds of the town grew distant, faint conversation from the estate could be heard. He stopped and strained his ears as the voices of women floated over the hedge, but no words could be made out. Out of the darkness, the bobbing light of the patrol appeared again, tracing the edges of the estate. He peered at the hedge. Was it thick enough to hide him entirely? Or would he be left with his arms and legs awkwardly sticking out? There should be more than enough time to return if that was the case. After the light passed and disappeared out of his line of sight, he loped forward, low over the ground as he made his way towards the part of the leafy wall which was letting through the least light. The voices grew louder, and he changed his direction to get closer to them. He jumped at a sudden noise and dove under the hedge. Too loud. Too loud, too sudden. Surely someone had noticed. He opened one eye cautiously, then the other, as if doing so would make him less conspicuous. Before him he saw a portion of a pristine, blossoming garden illuminated by magical fixtures, carefully cultivated and well maintained. The shadowed portion he had been startled into was cast by a large tree in the corner of the grounds. A sigh of relief escaped his lips. He couldn't see anything past the tree, so no one looking out in his direction would have seen him either. He inched his way around under the dense bushes. If he could match the different voices with the speakers within, surely he could get more than enough for his trouble. No one had come out to check on the source of the noise which accompanied his clumsy entry, so he settled his nerves before edging out into the shadows cast by the garden lights. Liam looked at the hedge behind the tree, seeing how the shadows were cast to best conceal himself. He took several deep breaths before looking around the massive trunk. In the garden beyond, not 50 meters away, several women were reclining around a polished marble table near to an open fire. Upon the table was a shiny tray, plated with slices of sausage and cheese alongside rows of light crackers and a ring of candied fruits. The boy's gaze lingered on the food. He forced himself to ignore it lest his hunger give him away. Seated facing one another, the finely dressed women he had seen from before basked in the warmth of the flames as the coolness of the evening fell around them. He could finally clearly hear their conversation. Squatting in place, he tried to match their voices. He didn't even know who the noble women were, so appearance would be the best he had for now. His gaze went from figure to figure until he realized one of the servants, the one who had gotten sick, standing near the trio on one side, was looking directly at him. Her dark eyes reflected the flickering flame and the corner of her mouth turned up in a bemused expression. His breath caught in his throat. There was no way she did not know he was there, but how? Liam withdrew behind the tree again before turning to press his face to the ground, looking under the border hedge for signs of the patrol outside. He needed to get away before she raised the alarm. "Camilla, is something the matter?" A woman's voice floated over from the garden. "There isn't something frightening out there, I hope." "Not at all, my lady," came the reply. "An amusing thought crossed my mind." "Only someone like you could find amusement with such dreadful business at hand," the first woman said. "We can't afford to be distracted here." "Of course, my lady," Camilla replied again. "My apologies." Liam ceased his retreat, returning to the shadow of the big tree. He did not know why, but his intrusion had not been reported. Maybe the woman decided he was of no consequence. She had held an expression of amusement. Perhaps he was just being toyed with, not even considered a threat to whatever they were doing. Looking back out at the women seated around the fire, he saw that all of those present seemed focused entirely on the discussion. "The only convincing that needs to be done," the woman facing away from him said in a thin voice, "is convincing these rebels to cease this foolish standoff. Such rabble has no business occupying my domain." He had never seen or heard the woman speak before, but, by her words, she should be Countess Jacqueline Fassett. He had not heard of any rebels, either. There was nothing of the sort mentioned around the town, though it could explain why times had become harder over the past few weeks and why they were looking for fighting men. Countess Facet took a sip from her golden chalice as another woman from the trio spoke. Can't you just resolve this amicably and put the past ways of your family behind you, Lady Facet? Her high tones were measured as she attempted to persuade her host. The future holds such incredible prosperity for everyone that I can't imagine that either of you would be dissatisfied with a reasonable settlement. This dispute over the succession only continues to bring further ruin upon your people and your house for no worthwhile benefit. The ringleader of this rebellion will not be satisfied until he has cast me from my seat and banished me from my lands or worse, Lady Wagner. Lady Facet said, I must put this animal down and all of his collaborators. I need not remind you that enforcing justice in my own lands is my right, and you have none to interfere. Oh, for the God's sake. The last amongst the women gathered spoke. Lady Facet won't even call her brother by name anymore. How can you even refer to him like some sort of beast? My dear Campbell died at Katza, Lady Facet replied with a sniff. Whoever it is leading these rebels claiming to be him is no brother of mine. At least you still have a brother. The other woman nearly yelled, all of our brothers actually died in the battle that you pretend to have claimed yours. Silence filled the night following her outburst, punctuated by the sounds of the fire and the distraught noblewoman's sobs. This is getting us nowhere, the first woman, the lady sitting between the two, said. Lady Facet, do you truly understand the consequences of your decisions here? Do you presume to threaten me, Countess Corlin? Lady Facet's voice rose. I do no such thing, Lady Facet, Countess Corlin sighed. We are trying to help you. The entire House of Lords does not wish to witness the result of this destructive course you follow. Since both you and your brother have chosen to shun our words, we have no choice but to enact our sanctions on your entire domain. Countess Corlin rose to her feet, and the two ladies to either side rose with her. The woman standing behind them, the one who had spotted him, prepared their things to leave. Not that it will matter, Countess Corlin said in parting. The whole realm has returned to their duties, so it's only a matter of time before the royal court reaches the limits of their patience and turns their attention to the growing eyesore that is your fief. I'm afraid you will not survive this, Lady Facet. I can only pray that your people are not made to pay for your folly. The visiting ladies made their farewells and made their way out of the garden and through the courtyard of the manor. After the sound of carriages receded beyond the bounds of the estate, Jacqueline Facet abruptly rose and aimlessly hurled her chalice. With a screech, she swept the untouched food and drink on the table into the flames. The boy backed away and lowered himself to creep out of the hedge. It was time to leave. A rebellion. The royal court. Nobles from the east, delivering a warning from the other lords. They mentioned the old count's son being alive, but the countess denied it. If Campbell Facet was alive, he would be count and living in this manor, not his sister. No one in the town talked about anything like this, and the town was where all the information in the county eventually found itself. The more he tried to make sense out of it, the less it did. Liam shook his head. What mattered was what it was worth. He was the only one with this information, so he would be able to get plenty enough for a meal. Safely escaping the estate, he returned to the town below and went to locate several brokers to sell his findings to. In the end, he had earned 12 additional copper coins for his trouble. He dared not hold on to his windfall, so he had instead bought what amounted to a feast and headed straight home. Liam ran through the alleys with the full meal in his arms. He lightly skipped over the pools of standing liquid as he navigated the bowels of the town, both proud and excited that both he and his sister could enjoy a filling meal for the first time in far too long. He turned one last corner, into the secluded cul-de-sac where they had found a place that was sheltered from the rain by a small overhang and high enough to not become flooded in the spring torrents. Say, he called out. Liam came to the end of the small section of alley, standing over the corner that had become their dwelling for the last few weeks. Say? He checked for the thin, ragged fabric that they slept on every night, folded and stuffed into a crack in the wall. It hadn't been disturbed since the morning when the both of them had gone out to look for errands to be done. There were no new footprints or any signs that anyone had been here, either. Say knew that young girls that went to the wrong parts of town had the tendency to disappear, so he was reasonably confident she would be as safe as one could call themselves by staying well away. He turned around one last time in the silence before heading back out the way he came, towards the ways where her sister should have come from. Along the way, a muffled curse and the sounds of sporadic scuffling sent him into a run. Not far away, he found a group of 3 men trying to drag the same number of girls away somewhere. A middle-aged woman holding a thin, lacquered pipe between her fingers stood behind them, watching the struggle. "Hey, don't damage them," she warned the men in a low voice. "These are the best ones we could find here." Smoke from the pipe trailed through the air as she gestured towards them, but the men were having a hard time trying to keep the girls quiet as they twisted about. He saw a flash of dirty blonde hair drift out from behind one of the ones facing away from him. "Say," he shouted. Liam moved without thought at the sight, charging towards the man that was struggling with his sister. He threw himself bodily, but the man barely budged. Liam bounced off and fell to the alley floor. The food spilled out of his arms and scattered into the pools of filmy mud. He ignored it, gaze running over the men as he reoriented himself. The woman looked down at the boy that was suddenly sprawled on the floor of the alley before her. "Eh? Who are you?" Following his wild-eyed gaze, her tone changed. "Is this your sister?" She smiled. "Jem, you look pretty decent too. Come with us, boy, we'll take the both of you to a better place than this." Liam looked at her sister, who shook her head vehemently at his unspoken question. Yeah, he thought not. Snatching a piece of old wood discarded on the wayside, he rose to his feet and swung with all his might. The rotted plank broke apart over the side of the man's knee, and there was a sharp pain in his palms. "Fuck!" the man shouted as he danced to the side and dropped Say. Ignoring the burning sensation in his hands, Liam went for another piece of wood, but the man's boot lashed out and dashed him into the wall of the nearby building. Crushing pain filled the world, and he found himself on his back. Laboring for breath, he struggled to sit up. A looming figure overhead filled his blurred vision. "You're dead, you stupid little shit," the man he had struck growled as he pulled a long club from his belt. "Hey, that's good coin you're throwing away there," the woman said. "Not coin," the man spat. "Food for the rats." The boy dimly heard his sister screaming across from him. The arms and legs which had struggled so fruitlessly against her captor were equally powerless in holding him back. The man's arm rose, but the blow did not fall. A metallic scent filled the alley before the man fell to his knees instead. 4 thin lines ran across his throat, and he dropped his weapon to clutch at his neck. Blood welled out from between his fingers as he made a futile effort to stem the flow. What?" The woman's voice trembled, eyes wide at the sight of the crimson stain running down the man's greasy shirt to pool on the ground beneath him. A startled cry came from another of the men, near the other wall of the alley. As his cries quickly turned to anguish, he dropped the girl to the floor below. All eyes were riveted to him in abject terror as they took in the sight of a dark set of talons reaching out from the shadowed wall. Whatever it was, it had grabbed its victim by the head, or perhaps grabbed was not the right way to describe it. Each talon sunk into the man's face, one into each of the man's eyes, while the remaining 3 punctured his cheeks. His weak attempts to flail at the arm sticking out of the wall simply passed through it, no more effective than swinging at a shadow. The cries ceased for a moment, filling the air with an eerie silence before the man began to wail in panic as he was raised off of his feet. He continued swinging his arms to no avail as blood ran out of the holes gouged into his face. The man's struggling weakened to nothing by the time he was slowly raised a meter off of the ground. The shadowy hand squeezed, and the ruin of the man's face detached from the rest of his skull. His body flopped to the ground with an arc of blood, spattering the girl who was frozen in terror near where he had fallen. The final man had seen more than enough. He released his girl and fled up the alley, bowling over the woman in his path. Not 5 steps into his panicked flight, the dark talons reached out from his shadow and snatched his ankles. As he tumbled forward to the ground, his feet were yanked sharply in the opposite direction, and his face whipped into the ground with a sickening crunch. The woman edged back from the fallen man, as their brutal assailant did not slip back into the darkness. Its claws seemed to grip the edges of the shadow it lay within, as if to pull itself out of the ground. The odor of her soiling herself joined the scent of blood filling the air as they saw that what rose from the shadow was shadow itself. From the back of its emaciated torso, tattered, bat-like wings with membranes formed of pure darkness sprouted. Sinewy arms extended past its waist, from where dangled the talons still dripping crimson. No legs appeared as it continued to rise, only a wavering, translucent shadow drifting over the ground. 2 gleaming yellow slits peered in their direction as it turned its attention their way. The woman finally rose with a pitiful noise, turning to flee. She did not waste her breath to scream, and her billowing skirts filled the alley until she disappeared around a corner. Liam. Say's voice roused him from his pain-induced stupor. He looked up and met her clear blue eyes as she leaned over him in tearful worry. He tried to speak, a groan of pain was forced out of him instead. "We need to run, Liam." Say's hands hovered hesitantly over his body as she tried to move him. Whenever she tried to pull on his clothing or his limbs, he let out another pain groan and she flinched away worriedly. Panicked scrabbling focused their attention away again. One of the other girls had gotten up to her feet to run. She made it not 2 steps before the shadowy monster flickered into existence in front of her. With a startled gasp, she immediately backed away and tripped over the other girl behind her. The shadow monster slowly advanced towards them, and the 2 girls untangled themselves from each other to get away. From one side to another it flickered in and out of the darkness as it blocked their attempts to escape, sickly yellow eyes leering at them in amusement. The 2 girls soon found their shoulders pressed to the wall of the building beside Liam and Say. "Liam." Say's terrified voice leaped out to call his name. Liam rolled onto his side and pushed himself upright, ignoring the agony in his side. Using the wall at his back to support him, he rose halfway to his feet before he slid back down. His vision turned white as his body was jarred against the ground. The monster seemed content to watch his struggles, its eyes turned up in glee. After Liam fell once again, it rose to loom over them, spreading its shadowy wings wide. Looking to each of their gaunt faces, it seemed to savor their suffering, fear and pain. Liam already knew that they were being toyed with and, one by one, they all understood that there would be no escape. When it appeared that each of the children had resolved themselves to their fate, the monster spoke in a sibilant whisper that chilled their blood and raised goosebumps as it washed over their bodies. "Camilla will see you now,